Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, public school advocates. It's the Ask Dr. Be Good show where we share the practice, the pedagogy, and the politics of what's currently happening in public education. As always, I ask that you write your name in the comments when you come in. Thoughts, observations, comments, and questions about the topic being discussed. I'm a longtime teacher, so you know I enjoy having an actively participating class during the show. Even if you listen later, you can still pop your questions in because I'll get an alert and I'll be happy to respond. So let's get started. We have a special show today because it is the start of our Black History Month. And to help us with that, we have brought a friend to the show. He's been on before. And so we welcome back Clarence Glover, longtime Dallas activist, and talk a little bit more about your background, and then I'll talk a little bit about our series that we will be doing together.
Well, thank you, Dr. Good. It's certainly a pleasure to be back with you and your audience. And we are kicking off again February African American History Month. And so we're very excited about it, and we'll sort of be talking more about it. This year's theme is focused on the African American family. And that theme is established by the Association for the Study of African American Life and Culture that was founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And the African American Heritage Month, as we know it today, was actually started in 1926 as Negro History Week. And it evolved into African American History Month. President Gerald Ford signed it into a proclamation, and every president since then has declared the month of February. And it was selected that reason because Dr. Woodson was also celebrating the birthday of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln on the 12th and the 14th, respectively. And both of these individuals were key individuals for the abolition of slavery, of course, the Civil War in our country, which split our nation. And so this is why we have it in February.
So, and talk a little bit about the fact that, is it more correct to still say African American Month? Is it gone to Black History Month? Tell me.
Yes. Well, it was first Negro. It was Negro History Week, and the word Negro is the Spanish word for black. And so we have that word, the word Negro, Negrita, Negrita, and that's another whole component which I do a lecture on the African roots of Hispanic culture because of the Moors in Spain. So we see a lot of the words that impacted our history come out of the Spanish language. And so we were considered Negroes at one time, of course, colored. And then we went into the era of the 60s when we became black, or what we call black and proud, when we wore fros and things like that. And as we got into the 70s and 80s, and particularly my activism in terms of time, my life is in the 70s, moving in that time, many of us began to look at what we call the diaspora, meaning that the disbursement of African people all over the world. So when I went to the school district, before I went to the Dallas Independent School District while still at SMU, I served on the African American Affairs Committee for DISD, and at that time they were called Black students. But there's no place on the map called Black. There's no geographical location that's called Black. There's Asia, there's Europe, South America, etc. So I felt very strongly that students, African American students, Black students, should have an academic and geographical identity, not just a color identity. So it was DISD. We changed the name from Black to African American students in the Dallas Independent School District before I arrived there. And that particular change had an impact across the nation.
Oh, that's fascinating history there. Wow, talk about impactful. Okay, so we are going to have African American History Month series here, and I thank you for being on for this series and helping us through it. We're talking, like we have been today, a little bit about African American History Month, about sort of the timeline around just our racial past, right? And helping us understand why it's important to look back and move forward together, right?
Correct.
And in week 2, we're going to talk about public education in Black America, past and present. And then week 3, we'll talk about the civil rights era, your part in that, your meeting. You've met some very interesting African American civil rights activists, and so about that too. And then in week 4, we'll talk about the current civil unrest, the Black Lives Matter, the anti-racism movement, and what we can all do together to help keep this movement alive and moving forward. So let's go with what we're with our week 1, and just help us through looking back. And you, matter of fact, you just had you were focused in an article in the Dallas Morning News on the need to look into the past so that we could move forward together. Can you talk a little bit about that focus in the article?
Certainly. And if I may just reach behind me, I'm in my office, of course. And my company is called Sankofa Education Services. And what I have in my hand here is a wooden card piece I bought in Ghana, West Africa. And the Sankofa bird is a symbol. One of the problems that's happened over the years, we've studied European symbolism, mysticism, history and culture, Asian culture. We've not studied African mysticism, symbols, and so forth. So this is one of our symbols of the Sankofa bird, whose head is turned around, fetching an egg. The egg is here. The feet are moving forward, you see. And so this is what is called our bird. Then we have an adinkra symbol. So that's what Sankofa means. It is not taboo. Reach back and fetch what you left behind so that you can move forward. See.
Okay.
So this is the Sankofa bird symbol right here. And that's what you see over my head, the Sankofa Education Services. And we have what are called adinkras. I don't have it close at hand, but the adinkra symbol is a symbol that was made by iron workers and was placed in the walls and fences. I just draw it very quickly now, see if you remember it. And and I do this with students in my class. And some of you may have seen this symbol, if you can see it a little bit. It looks like two sides, they actually should be equal sides. And these are called the adinkra symbols of Sankofa. This is a Sankofa adinkra. Both sides, that means past and present, equally. You see this symbol most often in windows and in doors across the South. You see, those particular symbols were early on when during what they call the blacksmith, the African smith, the blacksmith, put these symbols in the doors and in the architecture in a way to remind us. So today we are able to, just like African women put them in cloth and quilts. So we have symbols in iron and symbols in cloth. So Sankofa means that. And so what we're about is that all other cultures in our history have had the opportunity and the privilege to study their history and to know their history. But because of slavery, particularly in America, African people were denied this opportunity, and therefore European people were denied, and other cultures, to know the history of Africa. Because we know that Africa is a homeland of humanity now. We know that Africa, this is where all human beings began life, migrated out, walked the whole way. We know this is where some of the first civilizations of the world existed, both in the Nile River and in West Africa and Shanghai, Mali. And when I was at SMU, I would do a thing in my class, and I would say 3,500 years BC at the top of a piece of paper. I said, go to the library and just find out what was going on in Africa and what was going on in Europe. 3,500 years BC. See you next time. The students would go to the library, and they would come back with a surprising amount of information. And I let them do this without me even lecturing at all. I hadn't even started the lecture. But what the students would come back with is that they found that in Africa, so many things had gone on 3,500 years BC, and that Europe started later. Mm-hmm. That was not to be prejudiced at all. It was to be to let them do the history, to do the research. And we then discussed it. Well, why? Well, it makes simple reasoning. If human beings began in Africa, then things would be started in Africa. Building, the Nile River, and then we began to see what is called the Enlightenment period, the Renaissance, and etc., going on in Europe as a result of many African influences. Like in Spain, when the Moors went into Spain, 711 A.D., when we saw that, it was the Moors who went into Spain and southern Spain and helped to bring Spain into this Renaissance era. But we don't speak of these individuals as Africans. They were Berbers. They were called Berbers or Muslim, but they were Africans. And so and until we do that, and then there is what is called the Teutonic origin theory that impacts what is called the academic canon in America. So while at SMU, I had an opportunity to dialogue with a number of people. One was Dr. Fred Wendorf. And Dr. Fred Wendorf was the director at the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man. What he had there at SMU, what many people do not know, is that SMU had at that time the largest collection of African artifacts in the Western Hemisphere. What I mean by that is that they had gone over, done research, brought mummies and bones and etc. And that was at this institute at SMU. Well, here again, much of the history of Africa is never with people, Black people, in Europe or universities in America. But what I'm trying to say about that is that with that information that Dr. Wendorf had and others, it coincided with what is called the Teutonic origin theory, which says a Germanic origin that is a historical, is an award given in history for Teutonic origin research, saying that anything done in significant contributions to world history is coming from a Teutonic or Germanic point of view. So the writers and the researchers did that at that time, and though we slanted it both in a male perspective, which was European male, as well as it did not allow women to have influence in terms of contributions. So both women were left out and people of color were left out at the expense. I mean, to have this one slanted view, if you will, of history. And so I think that African American History Month is an opportunity for us to begin the process of trying to bring a balance.
So when you ask us to look to the past before we can move forward together in our future, what things do you want us to sort of look at, especially in last century and this century? I'll keep it a little bit closer to our time, because time is something we have a whole lot of. So what are the things that you want us to keep in mind and want us to know so that we can move forward together in a more educated way?
Well, I think certainly in the last century, and we were there at that century point, you know, those of us who from the 20th to the 21st century, if you will. And I believe that we struggled with this whole ideal of diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism, all these terms that came up in the early 80s, you know, in the early 80s, and they were countered by the term political correctness. And therefore, people were attacked, myself included, to say that we were trying to rewrite history, that trying to create tension and conflict, etc. But what I suggested then and suggest now is that we cannot educate a multicultural society with monocultural literature.
Mm-hmm.
Any more than we can create a gender diversity society with information that does not include the presence of women in history, you see. So I think that the 80s was a point of tension where people were uncomfortable. Certainly, the pendulum has swung from one point to the extreme. And I have many friends who were on the extreme and during that time. You had people, because the pendulum had hung so long in one point, if you will, that the extreme opinion were there. Well, when that pendulum dropped, it swung all the way to the next side. And the law of gravity says the pendulum would come to the farthest point on the left. So that's what we got during that time. A lot of reaction to it was all, going up. Now what we're beginning to do is trying to get a pendulum to sort of come somewhere in the middle, if you will. So we're not being exaggerated on either side. We're not exaggerating European history. We're not exaggerating African history. We are trying to find now the truth, if you will. And and that truth hurt in the early days. Back in I know my lifetime, it was hurting to see students, particularly at SMU, struggle with it. Faculty members struggle with this information. Even African Americans who didn't believe it and who had seen themselves in such a negative way, we call so much self-hate and such a view of Africa, the destruction of the African American family that we saw, and we don't realize that it was systematically done. Uh, and to see the attempts of Dr. King, for an example, to help restore that. And I always say that Dr. King's last movement, I always ask people, did you know what his last movement was about? And we know it was about the trash workers in Memphis. But I said, okay, what was the theme of that movement in Memphis? Very few people know about it. And I have them look at it, I said, the theme was, I am a man. They wore big signs, I am a man. And that was an attempt at that time, given that era, for men who were the primary, if you will, breadwinners at that time. And plus, men are, and in history, we have hunters and gatherers. So men are hunters and gatherers by nature. They go out and hunt, bring food back, etc. This attempt by Dr. King was an attempt to make the African American man a respected symbol in his family who would earn a decent wage and take care of his family. That never happened. We kept seeing the destruction of the African American family, up until even Otto Kerner, who wrote the Kerner Commission report, he and others under President Johnson. And what the commission said, what white America doesn't understand, that Black America can never forget, is that white America created the ghetto, white America supports the ghetto, and white America condones the ghetto. And he went on to say we must move at all deliberate speed, do what we must to undo that. Well, we never did that either. The report was never acted upon. And so what we have seen since then is this reoccurring conditioning of what's now called at-risk communities, at-risk children. And we even label them like slave. I don't like the word saying slave. We call them at risk, the at-risk children, the at-risk community. We label them and take away their dignity. They're not at-risk children nor at-risk families. They're families who live in at-risk condition.
So I know that you do a lot of work with kids from communities that are labeled that. What are you doing to help kids sort of help themselves get rid of that label?
Well, first of all, give them new language. Give them new languages of identity, as my mother did me and us. My family, my mother, father, educators. I have a book here I'm going to just share. This is the first book that my father, but my mother was, and people would come by, and at that time in the 60s and 70s, selling books. This is the book my mother bought from one of the African Americans. As you can see, it's been taped up over a period of time. This was my first African American in Black America. And I want to just read to you what my mother wrote to me and to my brothers and sisters. I just have it to keep it up. To our dear children, Rosalind, Clarence Jr., Gina, and Cedric, we hope that the volume of Black knowledge will enhance the lives of you and your children, and that you may be able to understand the causes and effect of the many ills of our society and move in a positive direction to remove them, respectfully. This has been my guide. The book, this and my Bible are my both books. This has guided me. So
you have lots of children in lots of schools to do that with, don't you?
That is my point. I'm not married. I have no biological children of my own. So I have adopted the children, and this is the first time I've ever said this before. I have adopted the children that I've come across over the years to do what my mother and father encouraged me to do. And by many African Americans, and I encourage African Americans to have a book. And this is what we must do. I think you asked the question. We must make sure that every African American family has a book on African American history. If we do this, that'll be a major step. Because they just need to be able to sit there and read, not just the internet. because this is not good for the eyes of it. They need to be able to open up the book as I did when I was 13. You're looking at the book that I opened up at 13, at 12. You see? Seeing the people and the images that I saw when I was, 10 years old. You see?
And yet I will say that not all the kids that you've adopted are your color.
Right. They're
Well,
not,
yeah.
but what happens though, Dr. Good, is that since we're talking about African American history, and this is not either, but we must first ensure that the African American children have this. So
Mm-hmm.
they feel good about themselves.
Yeah.
Other children, other cultures, I submit to you, because of education, because of cultural pride, because of the Hispanic culture and the music and the art and the events, because of all the information European Americans have, because of all of the Asian activities that they do, and etc. Native American, the African American child does not have access to the type of cultural uh, information. So it's not fair to, how should I put it? We must let the African American child and African American families, you might say, catch up.
Okay. And
You
so
see? Mhm.
before I let you go, I'm curious, how would you counsel educators and parents, because we have both as part of our audience, in how to use African American History Month wisely for their kids? And we can do it first for the African American family, because it sounds like you said there's some tools that they need to have. Where
Yeah.
would they go for tools if they don't have them? And how do you see that playing out in their homes?
Well, of course, the internet now is with us. So, while I had this book was a snail book, snail pace, you now can just hit and boom, all this information is at your fingertip, of course. Uh, but I still have the magic of books. I love the magic of books. Uh, because we can't keep our eye on the blue light all day. It's not
Right.
it's not healthy. Okay, so we need books. We do book sales. We do book things at and that. Since we're talking, having an African American book fair,
Yeah.
an African
Okay.
American book fair, where we bring some of the unfamiliar books that parents and educators do not know. Educators, and the word educators meaning what? Educara, educe, the Latin word to draw out the best. Well, how can an educator know what to draw out of if you don't know the culture of the African American child?
Mhm.
If you here we have Hispanic children, we do language, we do muchos, mariachi, but I very seldom see educators knowing what to pull out. I'm sitting here smelling all my collard greens that I'm cooking right now. The smells of my foods, our foods, the music, the jazz, the blues, the hip hop. School is cool and the teachers are tight. I'm going to learn how to read and write. We are rhythmatic. We know that's what we do. And so if the educator is comfortable with that and doing it, they're going to pull out the best. But if you're going to bring to the African American child a monocultural educational environment, you're going to watch this. Educe means to draw out the best. Put an R in front of educe, you have reduce. So this is an opportunity for us to begin, and we'll do it later. Talk about, what is this way of using this material in other activities. Then, as we come to know and celebrate ourselves, then we can join in with other cultures and share with them and they with us. But it is never good in any situation, as you well know, with young people. Uh, if one child has something that another child doesn't have, it makes the other child feel very bad. So we must give our African American children a healthy dose of culture and
And
parents.
so, and
Parents.
so, how can parents reach out to you, for example? Can they reach out to you? Is it through your website? How can they maybe tap
Well,
into
certainly
your
with your
resources?
program, you can reach out to me at Professor Freedom at 214-546-3480. Again, 214-546-3480. Or my AKA, my other, Clarence Glover at Clarence Glover Jr. at AOL.com. That's Clarence Glover Jr. JR, no period, at AOL.com. And also, you can go to my website, www.sankofa Education Services, and look at information there as well.
All right. Well, that's a great beginning. Thank you, Professor Freedom, as we
Thank you.
go
Yes.
by.
And because
And
I am Professor Freedom, because we're taking the chains off your brain so your minds can work.
right, can work. And so we look forward to what you bring us next week, especially around public education,
Yes.
African American child, because that's one area that I don't know that anybody from almost any culture could speak well on or easily on. So let's bring that piece next week to
Looking
everyone.
forward. Looking forward.
Thank you, sir.
You're certainly welcome. Have a good day.
You too. And so thank you, Professor Freedom, for being on. He just could really literally speak for hours on this topic and this passion of his. And so we thank him for spending a little bit of time for us and for making African American History Month come alive with information that many of us will have never heard before, whether African American, white, or Hispanic. So please stay tuned for future week information. So we are still in our COVID pandemic time, and right now our latest COVID issue is having to do with the vaccine and testing and getting schools open across the country. I have been interviewed by several stations this week on teachers and the vaccine, and there's some states that have not allowed their school districts to open at all yet. They're still virtual. Here we are in February, and they're still virtual. And they were asking me, what do I think about that? And how can we get teachers to feel more comfortable getting into wanting to come back to school? Because in some states where they have teacher unions, the teachers have let the unions know by survey and by vote that the majority were just not ready and did not feel safe to go back. So let's talk a little bit about that, and let's talk from a across the nation standpoint. For example, in the LA Unified District in California, the superintendent there, Austin Butner, he believes he has the answer. He has, if you can believe this, he has partnered with 3 universities, 2 healthcare companies, and a pair of labs to help test over 400,000 students, staff, and parents. He says, I think we've built a system that is as complete as we know. He gets testing results by 5 a.m. every morning. And so he's an early convert to testing. But you know, the irony is they haven't opened their schools yet. They're doing all this. And despite the sophisticated regime that they're following, they have not opened their schools because the teacher unions have not necessarily embraced it to the point where they're being allowed to open. County numbers for COVID are still high, and until they reach a more acceptable level, despite all of this testing that's going on, they're not allowing kids back in school. A lot of districts across the country would love to do what LA Unified is doing, and many believe that now that President Joe Biden is in, that he will allow that. But that is very, very expensive. And in LA Unified, it's costing $150 million, I believe. It's expected to cost $150 million to go through this testing regime of testing all of those stakeholders. But locally, disagreements between unions and education officials over the extent of the COVID testing and the vaccines are derailing plans to bring students back. In Chicago, as I've reported before, Chicago has teacher unions that are saying no, that they're not going to open despite the repeated requests by parents to open. And so that standoff could actually imperil President Biden's promise of getting districts open in his first 100 days of his presidency, which would put it to about April, I believe, the first 100 days. So while frequent and reliable testing is expensive, many researchers are also saying it's not necessary. While data is useful, schools have safely opened without it. But at the same time, when we say safely opened without it, what we are seeing in the schools, and is not widely reported that I know of, is that when a school district opens up, like we have in Texas, the state of Texas has had its schools opened and have had to open if we want to get funded. What's happening is that we have a lot of closures within the districts. So what's happening, for example, is that you might have a district that's open, but let's say that district has 20 schools, 3 could be closed due to COVID, or some could have partial closings, some could have a grade level that's closed because of exposure. But those things aren't being reported. So that's sort of an interesting note from the field here, that even we have had to close. For example, I had one school closed for the 14-day quarantine, and then we opened up that school after 14 days, and the other school 2 days later had to close its middle school because unfortunately parents still are bringing their kids or allowing their kids to come to school either showing symptoms of sickness, sometimes not COVID, but sometimes it is, or they are masking the fever with aspirin so that they can send the child to school and go to work. And so it is not unusual at all for schools to have exposure issues, whether it's because an adult, and we've had well-meaning teachers who come to school feeling, they don't think they're that sick, and they come and then they end up with COVID, or kids. So it's sort of frustrating to think that there is such a thing as opening safely and then that's all she wrote. No, you can open safely, i.e. you can have some kids at school, and I've read that some, like for example, the school in San Antonio that's referenced in this article, they have 30% of their kids back. We have about 30% of our kids back as well, especially in the Latino communities. The Latino communities are the hardest hit, and so they are most hesitant to send their kids back. Then there is the African American community. They're also hard hit, and they are also hesitant to send back. And so it's been, yes, schools opened, but they didn't necessarily open to 100%. And if they did, if they weren't practicing COVID safety, and it's sort of hard when you have 100% of your kids and you've got 22 to 25 kids in a room to have social distancing going on, even if everybody's wearing masks. And so then you'll have a classroom that has to go home for 14 days, or you have a grade level and so forth. So it's, we have that happening, and I don't think we're getting the attention around that issue. Because I had radio stations call me and say, but schools are not proving to be super spreaders. Well, no, kids don't get it as quickly, but what's happening is they may come and bring it from home and pass it to our adults, who then, because they've been in front of 3 classrooms, all 3 classrooms have to go home, not the whole school. And so anyway, so in Texas, where districts must give families the option to go to school, San Antonio Independent School District was among the first districts to open in late August. And so about 30% of their kids, 49,000 kids, now attend. And testing wasn't very available back then, and it wasn't. But then the Texas Education Agency did make available the rapid test to all public education And even private schools in Texas could avail themselves of the rapid test. And so through a partnership between the state and a nonprofit, the district can now offer PCR testing, which is the more accurate nasal or throat swab that detects the virus's genetic material. So what we were finding is that the weekly quick 15-minute tests were not as accurate as the PCRs were. So the weekly tests are optional, but among those who have taken them, the results show less than 1% positivity rate. And the pushback still comes from teachers who would prefer the district still be virtual. And so even though, you know, again, you have a district who has bought into having weekly tests, they've bought into even getting a partnership to get the PCR, which is the 3-day test, they still have teachers who don't feel safe. And part of that has to do with the fact that in most states, getting the vaccine and being in line for the vaccine has been not favorable for educators. So as radio stations have asked me about that, you know, it's my contention that if we had taken the opportunity to make teachers and educators feel valuable by even making them second in line, you know, health care workers first, and then educators, then 65 and older with comorbidities and so forth, that would have gone a long way towards making educators feel more comfortable about coming back to school. And I think it would have helped cases like Chicago, where again, the unions are saying until our teachers are vaccinated, they're not coming back. So, I mean, write in the comments here whether you think teachers should have had the opportunity to be at least second in line for the vaccine. And that's number one. Well, should they have been? Number two, do you think that if teachers had been second in line after healthcare workers to get the vaccine, that possibly we would have had districts across the country feel more comfortable about opening up sooner than they are. And so, and again, many districts have yet to open. I mean, I find that amazing here in Texas because we've been open since day one with the choice of virtual, yes, but there are literally districts that have not opened, have been all virtual, even as the research is showing that face-to-face is more effective for kids. There are a few kids who have enjoyed the virtual and who do better, but it's not the majority by any means. And so we need to get them back. And that's what you know, the politics here that is jumping off the pages here. So for example, here's a scientist who happens to be, she's a scientist who conducts COVID-19 risk analysis, and she has some opinions about the value. She's a mother of a special needs child, and that special needs child does not do well in front of a screen. And so she also happens to be a scientist who conducts COVID-19 risk analysis. And so her opinion is that a COVID screening swab once a week is just not very effective. But if it makes teachers feel better and it makes them feel safer and more apt to come to school, might that sort of be something that all teachers should have available to them? And again, teachers in Texas do have that for the most part, but not everybody in all states do. Some union leaders say they've been blindsided by politicians' moves to return to school. For example, in New Mexico this week, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham said in a virtual State of the State address that schools will begin reopening February 8th. So Albuquerque Federation of Teacher President Ellen Bernstein calls that premature. We're trying really, really hard to avoid the open, close, open, close. Remember, I talked about that just now. Doing it carefully and slowly is better. So that political push and pull is likely to spread now that the legislators are back in session. You know, I did a show a couple of weeks ago talking about the fact that most states have their legislative sessions starting in January, going on now until May or June. And so in Iowa, Thursday, lawmakers passed a bill requiring districts to offer families the option to send their children to school, just like in Texas. Again, Texas has done that all year. As districts struggle to reopen, the type of coronavirus testing they conduct might become an obstacle. Scope and frequency matters. Buettner described that the random sampling is merely testing the mood, and Zimmerman said a scientifically sound program in schools would require testing everyone multiple times a week. Well, that costs too much money. It's just prohibitive. But the American Federation of Teachers President Randi Weingarten outlined the plan she'd like to see in an op-ed this week with Dr. Rajiv Shah, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, a nonprofit that addresses global issues like disease and famine. They argued that robust testing is the key to reopening schools before the vaccine becomes widely available. The foundation's plans calls for testing 300 million students a month. But such an initiative would carry a huge cost. Weingarten and Shaw estimated testing for the spring semester at roughly $22.7 billion. But they didn't identify who should pay for it. The federal relief bill passed in December gives Title I schools $54 billion, or roughly $1,000 per student. And with the PCR test coming in at about $30 a piece, a weekly program would quickly eat up those funds, says Georgetown University's Marguerite Rosa, a guru to districts hoping to stretch their federal dollars as far as possible. Biden's pandemic recovery proposal includes $130 billion for reopening, as well as an additional $50 billion for testing frontline workers, including teachers. We hope that's sooner rather than later. Deborah Gist, superintendent of the Tulsa Public Schools in Oklahoma, hopes the plan makes it through Congress. The district is part of a Rockefeller Foundation pilot program that funds rapid tests. Supply is a problem, however. The district plans to open schools in mid-March, but would only have enough tests to last about 6 weeks. So we strongly believe that a system of regular rapid testing to preemptively identify exposure is the best way to have in-person instruction. Gist said those who turn up positive are referred for a PCR test. So remember, we have the quick 5-minute test that gives us results in 15 minutes. And if it's positive, then they're referred to a PCR, which is the 3-day test. But Rosa argues it's unwise for districts to spend most of their relief funds this way. Due to its expense, testing has the potential to draw scarce funds away from addressing the chief educational outcome of the pandemic, which is the COVID slide, right? Learning loss at a staggering scale. Experts have predicted, and some districts are now reporting that students are as much as a year behind where they would have been in reading and math had the pandemic not occurred. So, again, Rosa thinks Weingarten's proposal of $22.7 billion, for example, might be better spent on students' academic futures, and she suggests a parting gift of $10,000 per senior for their first year in a public college or university, so they won't take on debt. And to her, districts fall in 2 categories. Open districts are so much further along in addressing learning loss, she said, naming Superintendent Pedro Martinez of the San Antonio district, for example. The other ones are still digging their hole and getting deeper and deeper, she said, and he's already building a ladder to get out. And so I guess in one way, I guess I feel better having a district that did open up face-to-face in August. We have struggled with the open and close, but we have been fortunate, knock on wood. We've had the occasional sick staff, but we have not had anybody supremely ill or lost anybody. We have had a few students who have been ill usually because a parent or another adult in the home has had it. But again, we've been very, very fortunate to have been helping our adults in each of the buildings, the school buildings, stay strong in their COVID safety implementation. And that's one of the themes that I keep hearing, and you've heard me say it, and I don't know if you know it's a trend, but as long as schools implement their COVID safety practices, it does lessen the amount of kids and adults who will get sick. The other big piece of an outcome of the pandemic, besides the learning loss, is the mental health issues that have come up from there. Of course, we are now hearing more and more that the suicide ideation, especially for our middle school kids, has been much higher. We have, as you know, child abuse, spousal abuse, and so making sure that we all are staying alert to that. Educators, and I just came off another child abuse training, because I'm always looking for training, especially around how to train our staff in recognizing through the virtual world some of these signals, because the reporting is way down. The child abuse advocacy centers are not saying that child abuse is down. What they're saying is the reporting is down. And what that means is that the main reporters of child abuse, who have normally been teachers, especially now that we're in the virtual world, is much lower because we're not catching it. And so if you're a teacher or parent, if you're on, watching and you're sitting, many parents oftentimes will spend some time sitting next to their child while their child is doing schoolwork. Be alert. Be alert for whether a child's mood is different over time, whether a child, the bruising is the easy part, that's the easiest one, but oftentimes it's the rarest, right? Most people are not going to leave marks. And so be alert for other signals of child abuse. And again, one of the outcomes that we've had during this pandemic is our mental health support groups around the country rising up and uniting and getting stronger in their support for mental health issues and help for not only children, but also adults. And so we're going to listen to a video from Laura Montoya. She's a counselor for public education elementary, and she's going to share with us some national resources that adults can tap into if you're just feeling at wit's end. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It is so important that we get more comfortable with taking care of ourselves, taking care of others, not only our children, but other adults, by helping them get the help they need. So Laura, share with us your new resources.
Dr. Good, thank you for allowing me to share with the audience some mental health resources based on the needs that have emerged due to this pandemic. But first, let me briefly share some mental health data that shows how this pandemic has impacted our nation's health, emphasizing the importance to cope with anxiety and depression. Mental health data shows more than 34,312 people have had anxiety since the pandemic. Dr. Good, what is truly devastating are the impacts on mental health are more pronounced in young people. Now, with these numbers in mind, I would like to share some resources that have emerged based on those mental health needs. We have the Grant Hooley Burton Foundation that offers help to parents, students, and school staff, or basically anyone needing mental health support. They can help you handle some of the mental issues that are happening due to the pandemic. And sometimes what we need is someone to listen who cares, someone to be accountable to, or someone to be consistent just by being there. And we have put this information in the comments, so please know that these resources are waiting for you to reach out should you need them.
Mental Health Navigation Line. This is Carrie. How can I help? Yeah, hi. I'm actually calling about my daughter. She's been having a difficult time lately, and she's expressed several times that she'd like to talk to somebody. Oh my gosh, as a mom, let me see. Can I talk your ear off today? I got all the time in the world. Okay, well, the word she did use was depression and anxiety. Thinking about it, I bet has given her some relief. That's such a great step in the right direction. I understand what she's going through, but you just feel helpless, like all the way around. I get it. I have a daughter who suffers from depression as well. I'm going to take some information, gather that all, and then I'll turn it into our resource manager, Ashley. Then she's going to find you some resources and email those to you in a couple of days. And after that, we'll follow up and see if you received it and if any of the resources were helpful or if we could get you any additional resources. Well, okay, that sounds great.
Mental health services are needed. We know it can be a very scary process, and so it's a wonderful feeling to see that we are being utilized.
Thank you so much for the amazing services you guys offer. I'm glad that I can finally take that first step now.
The helpline is who I can trust to get back to me with helpful resources in a timely manner, especially when I'm not having luck hearing back from other resources.
I'm glad you all are here to help. All the resources are wonderful.
You gave me the one number I needed.
I'm so grateful this helpline exists. The resources were so helpful, and we've already made our first appointment.
We would love to have all of you just go to Google, find my representative, find my governor, and then click on that contact link and let your governor know, let your legislators know how you feel as a constituent as to whether you think educators should be bumped up right away to get a vaccine. And that's my little advocacy piece for today. Mostly, I hope that you left with the understanding of how important all of this information is and how important it is that you continue to be here and learn more about how you become a stronger advocate for public education. All of us must be part of helping kids become more than hourly wage hour graduates. We need career-minded taxpayers who will help keep our economy strong in the future. And if we don't help these kids today, they're not going to help us later when we need them the most. So join me in my constant public ed advocacy to become a pub ed advocate for us every week. See you again next week, and don't forget we will have our second in the series of African American History Month with Clarence Glover, aka Professor Freedom. Stay safe, and we'll see you back next week. Thank you, everyone.